Hello and welcome to Freedom Watch, your daily dose of raw liberty. Streaming online at foxnews.com, I'm your host, Judge Andrew Napolitano, here defending freedom, defending your natural rights, and defending your right to have a government that stays within the confines of the Constitution. During the 20th century, we suffered not only the Great Depression of 1929, which Hoover and FDR extended right up to 1946, we also suffered a horrific depression in 1920 and a serious recession in 1987. In the early 20s, President Harding was implored to borrow and spend in order to jumpstart an economy that was battered with over 12% unemployment. And after Black Tuesday in October 1987, when the stock market lost over 15% of its value in just a few hours, President Reagan was urged to use the federal treasury to get things back on even keel. Both presidents rejected the advice given by their big government advisors, yet both got us out of each crisis. How did they do it? Here to explain is my next guest, Thomas Woods, author of 9 books, including two New York Times bestsellers, the most recent of which is called Meltdown, a free market look at why the stock market collapsed and the economy tanked, and government bailouts will make things worse. Tom, welcome back to Freedom Watch.
Always a pleasure, Judge. Thank you.
What happened in 1920 and 21 that was such a horrific depression that most of us don't even learn about from the public schools today?
Well, to make a long story short, it followed the same sort of pattern that we've observed in all the depressions throughout American history, from the 19th century to today. You have a long boom that's fueled by easy credit pumped in by the Federal Reserve, and eventually the economy catches up to this trickery and you wind up with a bust. And so we had big money growth in the years leading up to 1920, and then we had the bust, and we had very suddenly double-digit unemployment, double-digit percentage drops in output, and everything just looked terrible. This is the deflationary spiral that we're all told to fear. And so, of course, the conventional wisdom today would be to have said that what we need is fiscal stimulus and monetary stimulus, pump up the money.
Let me stop you. This is 1920. The Federal Reserve is only 7 years old. This is the first crisis that the mismanagement, the unconstitutional and illegal, I think you'd agree with me, mismanagement of the federal banking system or the central banking system by the Federal Reserve has caused. So the president is Warren Harding. What are the pressures on him, and what are his advisors saying to him, and who is one of those advisors?
Well, interestingly, one of those advisors is Herbert Hoover, the Commerce Secretary. And this is the guy we're all told that during the Great Depression 9 years later was the one who supported the free market and was just sort of a doltish, moron who sat back and did nothing during the Great Depression. But
we were told his middle name was laissez-faire.
Exactly. Whereas during that depression and during 1920, he was calling for government intervention. He was urging Hoover was urging Harding to engage in what we would today call fiscal stimulus, public works projects, put people to work. He urged this strenuously, and Harding more or less ignored him. And so what we instead had is the government cut the budget from 1920 to 22 by about a half. The Federal Reserve System didn't actually do anything to turn the money supply around. So they didn't engage in open market operations, and tax rates were cut, marginal tax rates for all income groups.
Right.
The national debt was cut by 1/3. And so now you would think, again, according to the conventional wisdom, apparently we never recovered from this, right? You can't solve a depression this way.
Tom, how long did the depression of 1920-21 last?
Well, Benjamin Anderson, who was a Columbia professor and a real expert on finance, who was something of a contemporary, writing about this later, said that by the end of the summer of 1921, you could already see the thing turning around, that we had cleared out all the bad debt and all the bad investment, and we were starting to turn things around. So we had a very rapid recovery at the very time, interestingly enough, that Japan was doing sort of the opposite, propping everything up, government intervention, the same way they did in the 90s, and they had nothing to show for it but stagnation. So we get out of this quickly by doing the opposite of what we're told to do today, and isn't it interesting? No one ever hears about this depression of 1920.
We're chatting with Tom Woods, author of the New York Times bestseller Meltdown. Let's skip over the Great Depression because we'll come back to it, and let's go to October 1987 when we suffer a catastrophic loss in the equity value in the stock market that is so bad that they stopped the closing. This is before they stopped the trading. This is before the days where the computers would automatically cut it off. And Ronald Reagan is president. It's the third year of his second term. He's under pressure to do something with the federal treasury. What happens in October of 1987? How bad is it? What do they want him to do? And what does he do?
Well, it is a serious stock market correction and we already started to see stock prices sort of heading downward by the summer, but then by October there's a severe downturn, as you say. And it's true that the federal government more or less stayed out of this. At the same time, the Federal Reserve did come to the rescue. This is right very early on in Greenspan's tenure. And this is one of the events that gave Greenspan the reputation for being the guy who, if things turn sour, don't worry, Greenspan will come to the rescue. So
the maestro.
Exactly. So there was an attempt by the Federal Reserve System to pump liquidity into the system, which of course means, printed money.
But the president decided he would not do anything. He wouldn't ask for more borrowing. He wouldn't increase spending. He wouldn't create make-work jobs.
Right.
He would either let the free market deal with it or allow the Federal Reserve, which he's virtually powerless to stop, to do it.
Right. From his discretionary point of view, he by and large stayed out. The Fed, as I say, did intervene, and my friend Joe Salerno at Pace University actually links the Fed's flooding of the economy with credit in 1987 to the 1990-91 recession that came later. So as usual, what the Fed does is in the short run, it papers things over, but inevitably you get bitten. But you're right, it is an example of, on the fiscal side, as Reagan had often done, just saying, no, there's no way we can improve on how the market is going to sort this out on its own. We can't live in a fantasy world and try to prop up phony prices of things. The market has to reprice things.
Without getting into the weeds, because we could talk about this all day, the Depression that first struck in 1929, that was at its worst in 1933, when did that end?
Well, some people would say it ended at the beginning of World War II. But for reasons that we wouldn't be able to discuss here simply because of the time constraint, there are quite a few people, especially Robert Higgs of the Independent Institute, who have made an overwhelming argument that, in fact, World War II was not, that the numbers that seem to indicate that World War II was a time of prosperity are not believable, and that, in fact, prosperity properly understood, which really involves prosperity for consumers and actual people as opposed to government. Government spending doesn't make us prosperous, but the private economy recovered after World War II in 1946.
Okay, so we could safely make an argument that whatever Hoover did in 29 and everything that FDR did right up to, during, and through World War II did not rid us of the Depression. Why don't the people in government learn those historical lessons and follow them today? Well,
number one is they have no incentive to. I mean, they don't really want to learn about a theory that will take power away from them. They like to portray themselves as the indispensable saviors, and that's not certainly my argument, and so they don't want to hear that. But secondly, simple statistics and numbers can't always prove anything, because if I say to you, for instance, in the 1990s, Japan had 8 stimulus packages and it did nothing for them, our side would say that shows stimulus packages are a waste of time, and their side would say it shows they didn't spend enough. So you have to understand the economics and theory so you can make sense of the statistics. So these guys looking at the Depression would say, well, it just goes to show we didn't spend enough, whereas you and I would say, well, it just goes to show they did too much. So we have to understand how the economy works before we can make sense of the numbers.
Tom Woods, thanks for joining us on Freedom Watch.
My pleasure, Judge.